Hello and welcome, everybody. Feel free to enter your name on the chat and maybe say where you're from or anything you'd like to share with the group. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I know people are going to trickle in, but that's okay. We'll start with some introductions. Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy that you all could join us today. We have a great guest today, Gary Brustin, and I'll start with introducing myself. I'm Monica Nines. I work for Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition as the Director of Educational Programs. And our other co-host is John Han Wang. He's also here, and we will be monitoring your chat. So feel free to chat or ask questions along the way. But Gary will be answering questions at the end. We'll have 10 or 15 minutes for that, and maybe even a little bit of extra time if anybody wants to stick around after one. I want to start by saying that Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition is a nonprofit member-based organization. So if you're not already a member, hope you will join us. Our bicycle summit, our annual bicycle summit is next week. So if you haven't signed up for that, be sure to sign up. We'll put a link in the chat. Our mission is to build healthier and more just communities by making bicycling safe and accessible for everyone. We envision a community that values and includes and encourages bicycling for all purposes and for all people. So we really want to increase the number of folks on bikes for everyday transportation in particular. We have two main focus areas. We focus on advocacy. So for advocacy, we work with communities, elected officials, planners, and agencies to plan and advocate for safer places and better infrastructure for everyone. And then on the programs team, we have programs to get people of all ages, all experiences, and all backgrounds on bikes. Our focus is to provide fun, educational, and inspiring events to help folks develop skills to use bikes safely. And also really important to us is for people to have a great time while they're out there. And we do this through rides, events like Bike to Work Day, a fundraiser ride we have coming up, and we have a ton of classes. So we'll be sure to put some links there so you could check out lots of the events that we have coming up. And then also super important to us is that our work centers around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And now on to our speaker, Gary Brustin. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about this talk. Mr. Brustin is a lifelong cyclist. He bought his first road bike when he was a teenager and has been an avid rider ever since. He graduated from the University of Southern California in 1971 and earned his legal degree at UC Law, San Francisco in 1975. He's a member of the California State Bar Association. His passion for cycling has also shaped his professional career. 25 years ago, he decided to transform his law practice from general personal injury cases to a specialized cycling practice. Today, his entire caseload involves cycling-related matters. He has over 1,000 bicycle cases. He has handled over 1,000 bicycle cases and continues to personally represent each client. Additionally, he has proudly co-sponsored numerous events and organizations. Several examples include Velo Girls, the Race Across America, Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition Bike to Work Day. In his spare time, he acts as a volunteer attorney for various bike organizations. He's also a very committed He's also very committed to bicycle advocacy. He currently serves on our board of directors at Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition. He also served on the board of directors at the California Bicycle Coalition for 10 years and the League of American Bicyclists board for 9 years. He maintains offices in Northern California and Southern California, and he can be reached at bikelawyer.com, and we'll put that email, we'll put that website in the link for you all too. So again, I just want to say we will have 10 to 15 minutes at the end. And then Gary may stick around for an extra 10 minutes as well if we have, if any folks would like to stick around. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Gary. Gary, thanks again for doing this presentation for us. We really appreciate it.
And thank you, Monica, and thanks to all of you for joining me this afternoon. I hope by the end of the presentation, you're going to have a much greater understanding of California cycling law. So let's shift gears and get started. The main focus of this talk is really going to be twofold. Number one, how to avoid bike accidents. And number two, what to do if you're unlucky enough to get into one. Our topics are going to be common accident patterns and how the law applies to those. Motorists' excuses. I think you're going to be surprised to hear what they're saying about their point of view. What to do after a collision. We'll look at what your responsibilities will be and what you need to do legally. We'll talk about bike advocacy, which I believe is one of the most important things for all of us to make our roads safer. And then we'll do the questions and answers. So let's move on to common accident patterns. I think that if you learn the most common accident patterns and how the law applies to them, you're going to be in a better position to anticipate them and hopefully avoid them. Let's start with the first one. This is the intersection left turn. Without any doubt whatsoever, this is the #1 cause of bike accidents that I see in my office. And here's how we're going to go through these scenarios. I'm going to go over the facts with you so you understand how it lines up. Then I'm going to explain the law. And then I'm going to give you some common sense suggestions about how to avoid the accident. So this one is a cyclist is riding up along the side of the roadway. He's approaching a green light. And there's a car coming from the opposite direction. Car slows down, has his turn signal on, and just as the cyclist gets to the intersection, what does that car do? It makes a quick left turn in front of him. Well, what's the law on this one? Let me start with what we call the Universal Umbrella Bicycle Roadway Law in California. And that says that bicyclists have the same rights and responsibilities as a motor vehicle on the roadway. So in this situation, I think the cyclist has the right of way because the motor vehicle should yield his left turn to through traffic, and cyclists are through traffic. So how do you avoid this accident? Well, a lot of cyclists tell me, I made eye contact with the driver and I can't believe they turned left in front of me. Well, I don't believe that works anymore in today's world. A lot of people are wearing sunglasses, a lot of front windshields are tinted, and as we get to our motorist excuses point of view, you're going to see that they really don't see us in the first place. Let's move on to how you might be able to avoid it. And that would be, instead of looking down the road another 50, 100 feet to look for your next hazard, you may want to double check that car just as you enter the intersection and make sure it's not moving. The next left turn situation is the mid-block left turn or the gap left turn. I call this my little old lady case. I had it a long time ago when I first started doing bike cases. And it lines up like this. My client's riding along the right-hand side of the roadway. He's in a bike lane, by the way, in this situation. And traffic is backed up, as it does at rush hour. And a lot of motorists leave a gap, so left-turning vehicles can turn left into a driveway or a roadway. And that's exactly what happened here. As the cyclist gets to this position, the black car makes a left turn and shoots through the gap, and a very serious collision occurs. So I thought it was a pretty strong case because the law is that left-turning vehicles have to yield to oncoming traffic. But there's an extra added law on this one, and that is when you make a left turn and you can't see clearly lane by lane, you have to proceed cautiously lane by lane. This vehicle didn't do it. So once again, I thought it was a relatively strong case, move forward. The driver's insurance company felt, nope, it's the bicyclist's fault. You should have been paying closer attention and you should have been going slower. So we proceeded. Eventually, I got the statement of this sweet little old lady who lived in the neighborhood. And I asked her, had you made that left turn before? She goes, oh, I make it almost every afternoon on my way back from the market. I said, were you aware there was a bike lane there? She goes, oh, yes, I know the bike lane's been there for years. Were you aware at this time of the day that, cyclists would be riding down the lane? She goes, oh, yes, I knew that. And by the way, not only would they be riding down the lane, they'd be riding down the lane really fast. So I said, well, was there any factual basis why you didn't slow down as you went through this gap and look for them? And she said, well, my understanding is that he was on a bicycle, I was in a car, so I should have had the right of way. People still believe when they're driving out there that they have the right of way. And once again, we'll get to motorist excuses, but how do you avoid this accident? I want you to know I keep getting this accident over and over again in my office, and there are serious injuries associated with it. Because by the time you see the car, the cyclist just doesn't have time to react, and the injuries are serious. So you have the right to pass safely on the right, and you have to do it at a reasonable speed. But my suggestion is, as you get to that gap, please slow down and look for that vehicle that might shoot through. We have to keep doing that until the motoring public really learns all the laws, and that could be quite a while from now. Our next situation, if it's not a left turn, it's going to be a right turn. And this is going to be a situation where the cyclist is riding up along the right-hand side of the road. He's approaching a red light. The vehicle is stopped at the red light. And as cyclists, what do? As we're approaching a red light, we all want to time the light. So as we get to the intersection, the light turns green and we get to keep going. And that's exactly what was happening to this rider. But just as he gets to the intersection, the car makes a quick right turn in front of him. I'm going to take a quick time out here because I want to explain to you, this is going to be a slow, low speed accident, but it really results in some very serious injuries. I've had people who have had total knee replacements as a result of this, total hip replacements. I even had one client who didn't survive it. So please give special attention to this. So the rider's coming along, car makes a quick right turn in front of him, there's a collision. What's the law? Well, the law is, as a motor vehicle or any other vehicle on the roadway, you have to commence your right turn as close as practicable to the right-hand side of the roadway. Now, if you notice on some of our roadways where there's a bike lane that approaches an intersection, it's a solid line. And then for the last 100 feet or so, it's a broken line. And what the engineers, the highway engineers are telling us is, at least telling the motoring public is, please come into the bike lane and start your turn as close as practicable to the right-hand side of the road so you don't cut off the bicyclist. The second piece of law here is that you have to signal your turn. We all know that, we drive, but I'm not sure if you've noticed. It seems to me that most of the turn signals on most of the cars in California just aren't working. So what you want to do is not rely on that turn signal. I think what you want to do is stay back 2 or 3 cars until that light turns green and then proceed very carefully and make sure nobody is turning right in front of you. Next right turn situation, the overtaken right turn. Here we are, and the rider is going up the road. He's going through a green light, and all of a sudden he hears this racing motor to his left. He's thinking, well, what is that? And sure enough, just as he gets to the intersection, the car can't wait and maybe fall in behind him, which is what it should have done. It just has to rush in front of him and make a very quick right turn. Well, the law is pretty clear on this one again. You should start that turn as far to the right as possible. The motorist didn't. I think the cyclist had the right of way, but being right under the law is one thing, but getting injured is entirely different. So how do you avoid this one? I think it just comes down to situational awareness. We can also have, some of us wear rear view mirrors. I think they're helpful somewhat, but when you hear a car racing an engine left to you, to your left, excuse me, be aware that something unusual is about to happen and be ready to hit your brakes. Here's the next right turn situation that is rather unusual. It's brand new, but I'm seeing it a lot more. So please be ready for it. It's the imaginary second right turn lane. I don't know if any of you have seen this yet. It's rush hour. There's a right turn only lane. All these gray cars are doing exactly what they should be doing. They're waiting in line. You are on the roadway just to the left of the gray cars, exactly where you should be, because you want to go through the intersection. And then all of a sudden, this black car comes up alongside of you, and you hear that racing engine again. And you're thinking, well, it must be racing through the intersection because nobody would make a right turn from the left lane. We're seeing this more often. So please, in this situation, if you hear that racing motor to your left, hopefully it's going straight, but it may be going right. Next one, getting doored on the driver's side. I'm sure all of us have had a close encounter with a door on our bikes. And let me tell you about this case. This is my college student case. Young man was riding home from school late afternoon. He was kind of in a busy business district. And he's riding along the right-hand side of the road. Car is parked to the right. And just as he gets to this position, what happens? The driver in the car opens the car door, or shall I say, flings the car door open. They just come flying out sometimes. He tries to avoid the accident by swerving to the left. Well, he almost made it, except his right hand hit the edge of the door. He sustained a very serious hand injury with permanent long-term problems. What's the law in this situation? When you open a car door, you have to open it cautiously and watch for traffic. You cannot open it into traffic, and we are traffic. Once again, I thought it was a pretty strong case, but unfortunately, the driver's insurance company said, oh, no. It's the bicyclist's fault. Wasn't paying attention, going too fast. And I said, well, okay, let's proceed. So we did. And this case proceeded to something called a binding arbitration, which is like a mini trial. It takes about 1 day. It's heard in front of a retired judge, and it usually resolves the case. So we went to the arbitration. I presented my case. The defense attorney presented her case. I did my final argument, and she starts her final argument. And her argument was, it's not our fault, and here's why. Number one, the bicyclist was going too fast. He wasn't going too fast. He was going under 10 miles per hour. He was being cautious. You have to look, the speed law applies to us too. This was a 35 mile per hour zone, but it was crowded. It was a busy day, but under 10 miles per hour, I argue was very reasonable. Next, she said, you know, there was a very quiet residential street just south of this location that ran parallel to this busy business district boulevard. He should have been on that street. And because he was on the busy boulevard, that's why he got injured. Well, what's the law on that? You know, we have the right to the road, every road in California, with some exceptions, freeways, bridges, some tunnels. For the most part, we have the right to be on that road, even in heavy traffic. Next argument was, well, as he's riding down the road, he should have been checking each of the rear windows of each of these cars to make sure nobody was sitting in the car that could open up a car door. I think we all do that. But in today's world, everybody's driving SUVs. Everybody has tinted windows. Everybody has high headrests in their cars. Even if you're trying to look through the rear view, the rear window, you can't see. Her last argument was, as he's riding along, he should have slowed down when he rode by each car to see if there was somebody sitting in the car and he could see their reflection in that little mirror on the driver's side door. I'm rolling my eyes at this point. I'd never heard that before. Well, she rested her case. We finished up the case. We won, worked out well for the client. But I'm walking out of there and I said to the defense attorney, I said, you know, I've been doing this for a while. I heard those other three excuses over and over again. But I've never heard the look in the little mirror argument. How did you come up with that? She said, you know, as I was leaving the office this morning, one of the other attorneys said, why don't you argue he should have looked in the little mirror? And I just kind of walked out of it. Now, why would they try to do this kind of thing? I'm going to tell you why. I've been doing nothing but bike cases for 25 years. And here's what I've learned. In the court system, unfortunately, there seems to be some bias against us. And I think we all know why. Listen, the court system still works great. There's always bias somewhere in a case. But as bicyclists, I'm not sure that we are earning the right kind of respect out there on the road. Like I said, the umbrella law, we have the same rights as a motor vehicle out there, but we have the same responsibilities. Now, some bicyclists are running stop signs all the time, going through red lights, weaving in and out of traffic. Maybe on a Saturday morning, they're hogging the road with their bike club. The motoring public and the general public sees this. And you know, it's really hard for them to get over it when we hit the courtroom and say, now we want to enforce our rights. So here's what I recommend. It's a little naive, but I'm going to go with it. We all need to be goodwill ambassadors of cycling. When you're out there, obey all the rules all the time. So when we do go to the courthouse, or maybe when advocacy organizations go up to the legislature, when we walk in the room, they're going to have much more respect for us. Okay, so much for my soapbox, excuse me. Let's move on and let's go to the next set of facts. It's a side swipe. Cyclist is riding along the right-hand side of the road. By the way, I'm going to tell you about two cases, and they also illustrate electronic evidence. The first one is my client's riding along the right-hand side of the road. He wasn't getting close to an intersection. He was actually approaching a freeway on-ramp. And a minivan comes up behind him and wants to go on the ramp, and sure enough, passes him and sideswipes him, and he goes down. And the car keeps going. Well, there were no witnesses. My client's lying in the road. What do we do now? He had a digital camera on the front of his bike. Not only did it tell us exactly how the accident happened, but it also got the license plate of the vehicle, which we were able to use and give it to the police, and we tracked down the defendant and we got the case resolved. But what's the law on passing for a motor vehicle? Most of you probably know it. It's the 3-foot passing law, and we're going to talk about that in bike advocacy in a minute. So this motor vehicle should have passed him with at least 3 feet of clearance. But I don't know if you're aware of this. As of the first of the year, this law has been enhanced. Now, when you pass a bicyclist as a motor vehicle, if there is a lane to your left going in the same direction, you have to change lanes to pass a bicyclist. So most lanes are 12 feet. So now the passing rule is basically 12 feet. But if there's no lane to your left, then you have to pass a bicyclist at 3 feet. The point is, what I've noticed over the years, because of the 3-foot passing rule, a lot less of these sideswipe cases are coming into my office. So once again, congratulations to bike advocacy, and we'll talk about that a little later. Let me give you the second case. My client's riding along a bike lane early Saturday morning on his way up to the hills for his usual ride, and a truck passes him and hits him with a large extended right mirror. Well, my client goes down, gets a severe hip injury. He tells me, listen, I'm riding along. Next thing I know, I'm flying off my bike and I'm on the roadway. Luckily, the truck stopped, rendered aid, and we eventually got the police report. And I looked at the truck driver's statement, and his statement was, well, I'm driving along, and at the last minute, the bicyclist swerved in front of me. I went back to my client and I said, you know, I don't believe you did that, because obviously there's no reason to do it. You're an experienced cyclist. Can you give me a little more information? Now, let's rewind for a while. It's about 15 years ago that this case happened. And I think that was just the beginning of GPS on bikes. And he was an engineer, and he had one of the earliest GPS units. He goes, have you heard about GPS? I go, I've read some articles about it. He said, well, I had GPS on my bike, and here's what I can do. I can plot my course on the roadway and show you I was riding a straight line right up to impact. And not only can I do that, I can superimpose that line on a map. I said, please do. He did. We submitted it. We were able to resolve the case. Electronic evidence is very, very important. We'll talk about it later in regard to the legal part of the case. But when it comes around to sideswipe cases, how in the world are you going to avoid this situation? Well, I think you should ride as close as practicable to the right-hand side of the road, which we do have that obligation. I also think you should support what we call protected bike lanes that are going to separate cars from the bike lanes, which will hopefully make it safer for us. But other than that, I think we're somewhat at risk out there. All right, next one is a case that almost never happens, but when it does, it's very dangerous. It almost always ends in a fatality. Again, luckily we don't see a lot of these, but when we do, when a cyclist is hit from behind at a high rate of speed, almost none of them survive, even if they're wearing a helmet. So how in the world does this happen? Oh, if you want me to explain the law to you, it's simple. You can't drift over out of your lane and obviously hit somebody. But again, how does this happen? Well, when I give this talk live, everybody goes, well, it's texting. Everybody is distracted. Well, that is one cause. But let me tell you the main cause in my office. It's almost always a drunk driver. Almost always, 95% of the cases. The second cause is somebody who's on illegal drugs. I had a case recently where somebody had shot up heroin, got on the road, and proceeded to drive into the back of one of my clients and kill her. The next one is not illegal drugs, but legal drugs. I had a case where a young lady who had anxiety problems was prescribed Xanax. She took her dose early that morning. It didn't kick in, so an hour later she took another dose. Then she drove out of the house with her SUV, got on the road, struck two cyclists. Unfortunately, one did not survive, and the other one was left with permanent brain injury. The last cause would be texting. So, how do you avoid something like this? It's just so unusual, but it does happen. I think the best thing we can do is, again, support bike advocacy programs that will help us get protected bike lanes. We really need to separate motor vehicles from bicyclists, especially on high-speed roads. You can also support nonprofit organizations such as Mothers Against Drunk Driving. But other than that, I don't know what to tell you, other than to reassure you that it happens rarely, but it does. Okay, so much for this incident. Let's move on to man's best friend, cyclist's worst enemy. I'm sure that we have all had a close encounter with a dog out there, maybe more than once. And here's the way it lines up. You're riding down the road, and all of a sudden, a dog comes charging out from your right. I don't know why, it's always from the right. And the dog is running from somebody's front yard, front porch, or perhaps backyard. And it runs right into your front wheel. You go over the top, and most of the time, you're going to get a fractured clavicle. And it heals up, and thank goodness that's all it was. But sometimes, and here's the little detour again, sometimes even in a low speed situation where you hit a dog, and one client go over the top, squarely hit his head in the roadway. He was wearing a helmet, but he still sustained a permanent brain injury. So when you see a dog coming at you, please be extra careful. We're going to talk about what to do in a minute. But let's start with the law. When a dog is in public, off of your private property, it has to be on a leash. Sure, there's exceptions for a dog park, but for the most part, your dog has to be on a leash, and none of them are when these types of incidents occur. So how do you avoid it? Well, there's two schools of thought. When I give this talk live, I ask people, and they come up with ideas. Here are the two main ideas. The first idea is, when you see the dog charging at you, you want to speed up and try to outrun it. At the same time, reach down for your water bottle and try to squirt it. I think that's a lot to do when you have a dog coming at you. And once again, it can be a very serious injury. So the second school of thought that I hear is, why don't you just slow down and stop? Now, if a vicious dog is coming at you, you have to use your common sense. But I will tell you that for all of my clients who have been injured by a dog getting in their front wheel or stopping their bike, none of them have been bitten. None of my clients have ever been bitten by the dog. So I think common sense tells us that what the dog is after is not you. I think it's the bright, shiny object at the front wheel. Because once they get hit, and luckily the dogs never get injured, they just scurry home. They're done. They basically stop you and they're done. So I think on balance, what I would recommend, because the injuries can be so serious, is just slow down and stop. Hopefully the dog will just walk away, and so will you. So I know it's not a great way to continue your ride, but I think you're going to avoid the injury. Now, let's move on to another point of view. Motorists' excuses. I think if you take the most common accident patterns and you learn all these excuses and you blend them together, you're really going to be in a good position to anticipate and avoid bike accidents. So what's the first one? This probably won't surprise you. I never saw the cyclist. I hear that in the majority of these cases. I read the accident reports and the motorists always say, I just never saw him. Well, it's strange because I hear this most of all in the left turning cases. We're coming right at them. Now, in today's world, luckily, we have, front running lights during the day. By the way, there's no law that requires you to have them, but they're helpful because statistics show that they do reduce the left turning accident case. But again, never saw the cyclist. Next one is, you never heard the cyclist. Now I know we don't have horns on our bikes, but we do make somewhat of a noise just before impact. Next one is, I didn't realize the cyclist was, hang on, I've got to move my screen around. I apologize. I didn't realize the cyclist was going so fast. People driving their cars still think that we're out there riding along maybe 5 to 10 miles per hour like they did when they were riding to school. We all know better. We hopefully are riding faster than 5 to 10 miles per hour. The next one is the cyclist was going too fast. I mean, I'm making a left turn and this cyclist is just racing down the road and they hit the side of my car. That's not the law, but this is their point of view. Next one is the bicyclist should have been in the bike lane. Well, California law says if there's a bike lane on the roadway, yes, you have to ride in there with some exceptions. But that's not what the motorists are saying. What they're saying is, unless there's a bike lane on the road, we don't want you on the road at all. You shouldn't be there. You're invading the motor vehicle lanes. Next one, the cyclist should have been on the sidewalk. I still hear this in situations where there's heavy traffic and there's an accident. And they're going, well, it was so busy. Why weren't they on the sidewalk? Next one, why wasn't the cyclist on a residential street with less traffic? Well, that's our student case, college student case. Next one, wasn't the cyclist supposed to yield to me? That's a sweet little old lady case, and we still hear that. The last one that I don't hear very often, but it's still there, I thought they were supposed to walk their bikes across the street. Let's summarize what we are out there. We are invisible, silent, fast-moving objects that perhaps shouldn't be on the roadway in the first place. Please remember the motorist point of view. It's going to help you tremendously in avoiding accidents. Okay, now what? Oh, now you're in a collision. Now, what are we going to do? Well, we'll go in two areas. Number one, what you should do, and number two, what the legal case should do. Number one, you should carry emergency information. I'm sure most of us do, but some of us don't. Name, address, emergency contact information, perhaps some insurance information. Next one, seek emergency medical care. If you're lying in the road and you think you've got a broken leg, wait for the emergency medical personnel to get there. You can aggravate your injury. However, I had one client who decided to crawl across 2 lanes of traffic, even though he did have a broken leg. And I asked him, why did you do that? He goes, well, I just bought a $15,000 Colnago and it was sitting out there in lane number 2 and I was afraid somebody's going to drive over it. Listen, don't worry about your bike. Nobody's going to drive over it. The police or the fire are going to pick it up, take it to their station, contact you later. If you are injured, stay down and wait for emergency help. Next one, cooperate with the police. They're going to ask your statement about what happened. Just tell them what you know. Don't speculate. Just be honest with them. But if you have GPS and you have a digital camera on your bike, tell them about that immediately. And they will be able to take some of that evidence or note the evidence in their report. Next one, obtain witness information. The police are pretty busy every day. And when they come out to an accident, they're really reporting the accident, not investigating the accident. So they will perhaps get one or two witnesses and get their information and maybe get 2 or 3 lines of information or how the accident happened from them. But if somebody comes up to you and says, oh, I saw the whole thing, and they want to give you their name and address or contact information, grab it, because sometimes the police are just too busy. Next one, preserve your GPS and digital camera data. We talked about that. Next one, do not alter your bike or cycling accessories. The reason is the damage to your bike and perhaps your helmet is going to tell us a lot about how much impact there was and perhaps how much injury there was in the incident. Next, see your family doctor immediately. You know, they're probably going to take you to the emergency room. Hopefully, they're not going to admit you. They'll send you home and they almost tell you to follow up, almost always tell you to follow up with your doctor. And you should. For a couple of reasons. It's good medically, but secondly, your doctor is going to take a little more time with you and list every injury that you tell him or her about. And that's going to help eventually if you have a civil case, because now we're documenting injuries. Next one, submit all your medical bills to your health insurance. You can't wait for the driver's insurance to pay for these medical bills. It could take 9 months to settle the case. It could take 3 years to get to a courtroom. You don't want your credit to go bad. Finally, use your safety net insurance coverages. What are those? 3 situations. Number 1, you're riding along, car hits you, and it doesn't have insurance. Now, who's going to pay for your medical bills, your loss of time from work, and your pain and suffering or loss of enjoyment of daily activities? There's no insurance. Of course, you can sue the driver. That will take perhaps 2 or 3 years. Very expensive. Chances are they're not going to have a lot of assets, and it may not be worth it. On the other hand, you probably have insurance that will cover you for that. It's on your automobile insurance. It's called uninsured motorist coverage. Seems unusual, but that's the statute in California. You can use your uninsured motorist coverage on your car for your bike accident. So that's number 1. Number 2, what about your $15,000 Colnago? Who's going to pay for that if there's no insurance? Believe it or not, your homeowners or renters insurance will probably pay for it. People think that the only time homeowners is going to cover you is if it happens at your home or at your apartment. That's not correct. It will cover you in certain situations off premises. And the final situation is you're riding along, you're not paying attention, you're looking at your texts, there's a pedestrian in the crosswalk and you hit him and you severely injure him and he files a claim against you. Now what? Well, as a general rule, your homeowners or renters insurance will cover you. They will hire an adjuster, they will investigate the claim. If necessary, they will hire a lawyer. They will take you through a court proceeding. And if you're found liable, they'll pay the damages up to your insurance coverage. So always remember your safety net insurance. Now, what should you be doing legally on your case? And before I shift into the legal part of this, let me explain something to you. You win cases on evidence. You don't win them on flowery closing statements. I mean, those help sometimes, but really it comes down to the evidence. Sometimes it can take up to 3 years or longer to get to court. So if you think your rights were violated, you need to contact an attorney immediately. I don't mean let's wait 6 months and see how it goes, because that evidence will vanish. Let me tell you how I do it. First thing I do is get the police report, because it's going to tell me a lot about this incident. It's going to tell me exactly what time it occurred, the exact location. It's going to give me the name, address, and insurance company of the driver. It's going to give me information about whether or not the police took photos of the scene. It will tell me about the witnesses, and the police take maybe 2 or 3 lines from the witnesses, a short summary, and it helps as a starting point. But the police report is critical. It's the building block, foundation of the investigation. Next thing I do is have my private investigator get witness statements. Now, she'll get in contact with these people either in person or over the phone, and she'll get a recorded statement. I'm not talking 2 or 3 lines. I'm talking about 20 pages. I want to know everything about your case, whether it's good or bad, so I can prepare it and we can move forward. And witnesses, their memories are going to fade after perhaps a week or two. So we want to get to them as soon as possible. Next one, I want my investigator to go out and take scene photos. I want photos from every direction of where this accident occurred, not just the approach. I want north, south, east, west. In today's world, I am now starting to consider overhead photos with a drone. Next one, obtain building camera footage. My investigator walks the area, and if she sees a building camera, she goes in and knocks on the door, and we try to get the information, get the footage. Next one, look for government infrastructure and vehicle camera footage. You know, a lot of governments have cameras on their traffic signals. You go through a traffic intersection, and you always see them up there. You can try to get that. You can also get camera footage, perhaps from the police. They have dash cam coverage. They also have body cam coverage. Maybe even the car that struck you had a dash cam. I've had cases like that, and we're able to get that. All this footage is very critical and very helpful. The next thing I want to do is get your injury photos, because in 9 months or 10 months from now, when we perhaps get ready for a settlement, your injuries are going to be gone. Nobody's going to see them. And if it takes 2 or 3 years to get to court, certainly you're not going to have any lingering effects, probably, that are visible. So I want to get those. And finally, I want to get the property damage photos. Look at this bike. I know it's an old bike, it's an old photo, but the front wheel is tacoed, the down tube is bent. And I can tell you that is a very big impact. If that's what the impact did to the bike, and you have serious injuries, it validates just how serious your injuries are. By the way, I may have misspoken myself. I think we may have one more here. Right. Preserve your GPS and other camera data. Very important. Let me make one more comment when it comes around to the legal case. If you think you want to proceed, not just getting the evidence quickly is important, but sometimes you have to take procedural steps that are important. So for example, if you get hit by somebody, it's a hit and run, you can still use your uninsured motorist coverage on your auto policy, but you must make a police report within 24 hours. Now, there are exceptions. I mean, if you're in the hospital and you can't do it, certainly there is an exception. The second thing you need to do, if it's a hit and run, uninsured motorist, you have to file a declaration with your insurance company within 30 days. So again, if you think you're going to have a case, get to a lawyer immediately. It'll preserve your rights. Let's move on to advocacy. I am a big fan of bike advocacy because I really think it makes the roads safer for all of us. I'm going to give you 3 examples. The first one is the 3-foot passing rule. It took us forever to get this passed in California, but we have it. And thank goodness, because as I indicated earlier, I am seeing a reduction in sideswipe cases in my office, and I know it's a direct result of this. And I think I mentioned it earlier, but I'll tell you again, this law has been enhanced. As of the 1st of this year, you not only have to give a cyclist 3 feet, but you have to you have to change lanes to pass the cyclist. Next one is called a Class 4 bikeway. That's a fancy term for a protected bike lane. And what we know about these is when you remove cyclists from motor vehicles and you put a barrier between them, serious injuries are reduced, fatalities are reduced for cyclists, and there's more and more cyclists using the roads. Now, I know this picture shows you a downtown district. It has kind of flexible divider. Well, in low speed situations, these are usually enough. But in high speed situations, traffic engineering requires that they build stronger barriers. So out on roadways where the speed limits are 50, 60 miles per hour, if they're building a protected bike lane, it's got to really protect you. You can't be a soft barrier. Next thing is complete streets. What this means is when you build a roadway, the traffic engineers have to take into account all the roadway users, not just motor vehicles and pedestrians. You got to take into account bicyclists, scooters, handicapped, and anybody else that's using the road. And the more we do that, the more we put everybody out there in a safe environment, the less accidents we are going to see. So all of you should be members of advocacy organizations, and I'm sure you are, but I am going to recommend 3 levels. Number 1, you should be a member of a national organization, and I highly recommend the League of American Bicyclists, because they are doing things on the federal level. When they encourage legislation, it affects the entire country. Number 2, I think you should be in a state organization like the California Bike Coalition. When they do things, it's a state rule. And they were basically responsible for the 3-foot passing rule. Next thing is a local organization, and I'm a firm believer in the Silicon Valley Bike Coalition, but there are other organizations that are all over around the state that are local and are very effective. So basically, that concludes my comments today. Let me just briefly summarize. When you're out there riding, always wear your helmets. Always remember to ride defensively, especially where a car can turn right or left in front of you. And always remember the motorist's point of view. There are excuses. I think if you take those things into account, you do those 3 things, you're going to come out okay. But if unfortunately you're involved in a bike accident, first thing you want to do is get to a doctor. Next, if you think your rights were violated, get to a lawyer. But most importantly, get well as soon as possible and get back on your bike. Thanks again for joining me this afternoon. I'll be happy to stick around for some questions.
Thank you so much, Gary. That was awesome, really informative. We do have a bunch of questions in the chat, but I would like to say, if anybody wants to unmute themselves and just go ahead and ask their questions directly, you're welcome to do that. We could also read some of the questions off the chat. So I'll give you a few seconds if you just want to go ahead and ask your own question. Otherwise, we can read some of the chat questions.
Hi, Gary.
Was somebody trying to ask a question? Was not quite sure. Jordan, go ahead.
Yeah. So you mentioned at some point that you've represented clients that have unfortunately passed away due to these collisions. And I know there was a case in the Presidio a few months ago where someone was killed. A lot of times, like, you'll see a news article, it's like someone was hit by a car, and then you never hear about it again. Like, how often is there follow-up action that results in significant sort of charges against the car driver who was responsible, and how often does nothing happen?
Jordan, I can only speak about my cases that I've handled. And for every fatality case, there was a criminal action that ran parallel to the civil action. It was always followed up. And in my experience with my cases, the drivers always did time in jail. I hope that answers the question. Good.
Yeah, this is Cindy Steiger again. Gary, I saw an accident. I didn't see it, but I saw the results of an accident over Taylor Street Bridge. And I never was able to find out what they did to get this guy, because somebody hit this poor guy who was just a worker type person. You know, he's cruising to work. And they had the body outline laying there for months. And I never was able to find out who is supposed to be taking care of that kind of thing. I asked the San Jose PD, but I didn't find anything.
First of all, thanks for joining me, Cindy. It's nice to talk to you. She and I go way back. Anyway.
Yeah.
So I haven't had a case like that. But my understanding is if somebody gets hit and they're lying in the roadway, eventually another car is going to stop. Police are going to discover them, and they are going to obviously render aid if they can. If the poor person is deceased, that's another situation, but they'll start looking for evidence. The police are very good about this. When there's a fatality, their investigations are extremely thorough. So I have a lot of faith in our local police departments, and usually they follow through. I hope that answers the question.
He had, his bicycle was up on the sidewalk. Somebody had put it up there. And I just never heard anything about it. I happened to be there when the television station came by, and they asked me to make a comment about the riding and what happened. I said, well, I didn't see it, but it's a busy street sometimes, and people go zooming over there. And that was about all I could add to it, you know.
Well, like I said, we've got to put our faith in law enforcement, and they do follow up very seriously in fatality cases, just so you know.
We have a couple people with their hands raised, so we'll take Mike, Tim, and then Jessica.
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you so much. I had a quick question. I was speaking to somebody from the San Mateo Sheriff's Office the other day, and I've had this conversation before because they had been discussing video evidence. And the sheriff explained to me and said that basically the police cannot prosecute on the basis of video evidence if the crime committed is only an infraction as opposed to a misdemeanor or a felony. So is that true? And if so, is that a law? Is that something that can be changed? Is it a policy? So how true is that? And how do we get around that? Because that seems like a huge impediment to enforcing, things happening every second of the day on the streets. Thank you.
Mike, that's a very good question. Unfortunately, I don't specialize in criminal law, and I don't know criminal law and procedure. It's a whole different side of the law other than the civil law, which is what I do. So I really wouldn't hazard a guess at answering that question. However, if you want to send me an email and repeat the question, I will try to get you an answer from a criminal attorney. I'm sorry, I just don't know the answer at this point.
Great, thank you.
Tim?
Let's see, my question is a little bit related to the previous question, and it's also Akko in the chat has mentioned an ACTC member was killed not that long ago with a head-on collision. She was also one of our volunteers. I'm in a rural area where the SUV crossed the center line and struck the person and killed them. A lot of ACTC members are quite upset at being hit in a wide open area where the driver should have seen the cyclist. And a lot of the members are wondering, what can they do to show, or well, help, I guess. Is there anything they can do? They just have to let the criminal law case, go as it is, or can they show up in court? Does that help? Any words of advice in that space?
Yeah, I'm so sorry to hear about that. This was the carbon copy of that Xanax case I told you about earlier. It's horrible when you see a car coming at you and there's nothing you can do. In terms of what the bike club could do, I don't know if any of them were witnesses. If they were, that'd be extremely helpful. In terms of supporting the deceased cyclist, going to court is always a good idea, showing support. I know in other cases I've seen that, and I've seen them go to court actually wearing their bike jerseys. But I would clear that with a clerk of the court before you actually did it. But judges take these things into account, as do prosecutors, and it makes a difference when there's support in the courtroom. So I would certainly encourage them to follow through.
Thank you.
Thank you. Looks like we have lots of folks with their hands raised. We have Jessica next, then Jordan, Eleni, and John Han.
Hi, I'm sorry. I have 3 questions. The first one is drivers and neighbors often complain about kids, students biking side by side when they are biking, like in group of 3 or 4. I wonder if there's any law or whatever to educate the neighborhood or community that actually it's safer for them to do that instead of like 4 or 5 in a single file. And second question is, I didn't even realize the 3 feet passing law at all. And I don't believe many people actually know that. So what would be the better way, maybe this is from the community here, to educate drivers the 3 feet passing? And then lastly, I think a lot of drivers sometimes are annoyed about certain bikers even correct behavior, mainly because a lot of kids bikers just don't do like just not wear not do hand signal, not wear helmet, etc. Is there any law or is there any base that we could ask or suggest the police to issue the ticket for bikers that's actually breaking the image of the correct behaved bikers? Thank you.
Okay, good questions. Let me start with the first ones. You said you see students riding side by side. You want to know what the law was, and you want to know if it's safer for them to ride side by side versus single file.
Yeah, also from the law perspective, because I
Right.
know it's safer because the rest of my family all bike, and I've heard many times, but then you keep hearing drivers and neighbors keep complaining about that.
Well, here's what the law says. When you're riding your bike on a public roadway, excuse me, you have to ride as close as practicable to the right-hand side of the road. Now, there are some exceptions to that, but it wouldn't apply usually to students. So taking that piece of law, it tells you if we have them riding 3 abreast, then chances are they are not riding as close as practicable to the right-hand side of the roadway. So my interpretation of the law is they should ride single file. And quite frankly, in my opinion, I think it's safer for them to do so. Your next question was the 3-foot passing law. A lot of us don't know about it, it seems like. How do we educate people about it? I think joining advocacy organizations would help. I think they're spreading the word as best they can. I will tell you that, believe it or not, a good way to learn it is in the California Department of Motor Vehicles manual. When you take your driving test, they make a big deal about this, about bicycle laws. And getting all that information in that manual was a function of the California Bike Coalition. Other than that, I'm not quite sure. You can maybe talk to your local police department. Maybe they can do a public service announcement. But it is a real important piece of law. It really does make a difference. The next one is bicyclists with bad behavior. I couldn't agree with you more. When I told you there was a bias against cyclists in the courthouse, it really is because we are running through stop signs. We are weaving in and out of traffic. We are not stopping at red lights sometimes when there's nobody else around. You think it goes unnoticed. I can assure you, everybody notices it, and they are somewhat up in arms about it. So it would be great if the police would issue tickets, but that's a policy that has to be adopted in your police department. I will tell you that years ago, I was at a conference, a bike conference up in UC Davis. And UC Davis is known as the bicycling city. In fact, their city logo is a high-wheeler bicycle. And I was talking to some of the locals there, and I go, you've got so many students here. I mean, are they obeying the law? I mean, they're usually running stop signs. They said, you know, we do orientation here, and we tell them that if they do not obey the law here, they're going to get a ticket. And they generally also told me that they get the police out there the first week of school, and they put them at the intersections, and they start writing tickets. So maybe your local police department can do the same. And perhaps it's just a phone call. And I would encourage you to do it that way.
Thank you, Gary. So it is 1 o'clock and Gary has graciously agreed to stay another 10 minutes or so because we have so many questions. But for those folks who have to leave, I totally understand. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us. Hope to see you at the summit or our fundraiser ride at the end of October, or at one of our classes or social rides. Thanks for joining. If you have to leave, have a great day. And if you'd like to stick around for another 10 minutes, we'll be here. There's Jordan, Eleni, and John Han up next for some questions.
Hi, I have a couple questions as well. So one, you went through a lot of like steps to do after an accident to make sure that you can properly litigate. And that's very useful and not necessarily obvious to someone who's never had to litigate before. And like, if I was to get hit and I'm, unconscious or dead, I don't necessarily know if my loved ones will know all those steps. Do you have like a cheat sheet on your website or something that you could hand out to loved ones, be like, hey, if I'm in a bike accident, make sure you do these things on my behalf.
You know,
My second question is, you mentioned the GPS data that was used in some litigations. Do you know if consumer grade smartphones have accurate enough GPS to act in that kind of capacity in litigation, or do you need like a really good GPS device that is more accurate than a cell phone? And then my third question is, have you or any of your colleagues ever had to litigate against police departments for improper or illegal traffic stops, or charging people with bogus biking rules or that sort of thing?
all right, let me get started here. In terms of a list of things that perhaps relatives should do, I may have one on my website. I haven't checked it recently. I'm sorry for that, but I will tell you that this speech is being recorded. So if you want to go back and take a copy of one of the slides, feel free to do so. It basically does give you the list of things that you need to do. Bottom line is, though, if you tell your relatives, just consult with an attorney immediately. The lawyer will take care of everything. And this kind of evidence is better collected by a lawyer than perhaps someone else. Next thing is, how accurate is GPS? Well, that's a very good question. Jordan, are you an engineer? Because the
Yes.
engineers have explained this to me. And it has a lot to do with satellites and how many are up there and these things and accuracy. And to tell you the truth, I'm not an expert in the field. I will tell you that I've used GPS. The early GPS worked. I used it in another case, which was a cell phone, and it was relatively accurate. But again, I've never had to actually use it in a courtroom at this point, because most of my cases get resolved once I present the GPS info. But if I did have to use it in a courtroom, I would have to hire an expert, an engineer, to authenticate it, explain it, and get it into evidence. Next thing is the actions against a police department for some bogus activity. I really haven't encountered that in my bike cases. I've had unusually good luck with police departments. They've conducted good investigations. When I talk to them about the case, they are helpful. They sometimes will not give me evidence that I want, but there are ways I can do it with subpoenas and Freedom of Information Act statutes. But for the most part, I've never gone against a police department for some kind of unreasonable action. Oh, wait, one exception. Sometimes a client is offended in some way, or the officer has done something at the scene in regard to the investigation that really upset the client. Well, what you can do is make a complaint against the officer. Every police department has a procedure for that. I mean, they don't leave the complaint forms on the front desk, but if you think something went wrong, file the complaint and make sure somebody takes notice of that officer. But again, for the most part, I've had pretty good luck.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Gary. I have a question. You mentioned that the DMV and the driver's ed does focus well on bicycling. I'm wondering if you know of advocacy efforts to increase that even more, or any lobbying being done toward the DMV and driver's ed system.
You know, that's a good question. I don't know, but I know who has the answer. California Bike Coalition. I would send them an email, contact them, ask them what they're doing on this front. They probably are working on it to get it even better. But I suggest you go online and take a look at the section in bicycling. There are some small inaccuracies, but nothing I want to bring up. I'm just glad to see the information in the DMV book. But I think you'll be encouraged. There's a whole section, and it's nice to see it finally happening.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Gary, thank you for that wonderful presentation, and learned quite a lot, and noticed a few themes around in the questions that I saw in chat that I wanted to highlight. One was from two folks, with Mike and Torino, many cities seem to make safety decisions on the basis of liability risk. If that is the case, how can we leverage the threat of litigation to convince municipalities to make more safety improvements? And there's a follow-on chat message. Engineers by Torina, to engineers in my jurisdiction struggle to allow for better bike infrastructure or pilot projects based on the fear of litigation. Very curious to hear the answer to this. I'll do them one at a time, but I have two other things to ask you after this.
Yeah, I think, by the way, I've got some extra time. I can stick around for another 10 minutes or so at least. So people have questions, they want to ask them live or online, that's fine. I want to, there's so many of them, I want to try to get them answered. I think the question was, I'm not sure I got the whole thing. First of all, governments are saying we're not going to make infrastructure improvements because we're afraid of getting sued if we do. That is one argument, and I've heard it. However, from a strictly legal standpoint, if I were to go against a local government for some kind of civil liability because perhaps the roadway was in a dangerous condition, I have to prove that there was prior notice of the dangerous condition, or perhaps they should have known of the dangerous condition without prior notice. The should have known element is a little difficult. The actual notice is extremely helpful. So let's say you've got somewhat of a dangerous intersection and the city says, oh, we really don't want to go through this because we're going to get sued. Well, if they have between 5 and 10 notices of horrible things happening at that intersection because it wasn't improved, they're now staring into civil liability. So one way to get governments to change a dangerous condition, at least from a legal standpoint, is if there are problems occurring there, you have to notify the government. You need to put them on notice, as they say. And as something as simple as an email describing what happened to the head of the city and perhaps the traffic division would be helpful. Because if litigation starts, I can get all those documents and I can show, gosh, there are 10 complaints here and nobody did anything. And now they're really going to be held accountable. So that's about the best way I can answer the question. I'm sorry, it sounds terrible. You have to have a tragedy or numerous tragedies before you can force them to do something, but that's the way it works generally in civil litigation.
Gary, somebody actually had a good suggestion. Can you stop sharing the screen so we can see?
Oh, I can.
That's a
Thank you
for that suggestion.
Oh, look at everybody.
Yeah.
Hello. Thanks again for joining me. There's a lot of you. Thank you.
There's another one that I saw several questions on is about bike cameras. Do you have any advice on, well, like, do you want to have front ones, back ones, what resolution to, and type any specific ones to ensure that we capture the most accurate information?
Okay, well, legally, you don't have to have a camera on your bike. Let's start with that. But practically, if you're going to have a camera, I'd start with the front. That's very helpful because it can usually capture what's happening, the front end collision. It will also capture what's happening when perhaps something's coming behind you and keeps going. I like back view cameras also. I had a client who had a front and a back camera, and I was astonished at what I saw. I mean, I saw the whole thing. It was like running a movie. And that is priceless evidence. I mean, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and this one really was. So I recommend front and back if you're going to have them. In terms of resolution, I'm sorry, I'm just not that technical, but I do know the highest resolution will be better than a lower resolution. And perhaps you can talk to your bike shop or a camera store, and they can give you the answer on that.
Thank you. Related to that is, I think there was a question on, like, police departments cannot claim that they cannot prosecute a traffic infraction that is videotaped by a bicyclist if the cop isn't present. Is this true or?
Once again, anything on the criminal side, for the most part, an infraction is somewhat of a criminal issue. I'm sorry, I just don't know the answer. It's out of my specialty.
Okay. And then this question was related to some of the things we've been teaching about in smart cycling in terms of taking the lane. It was, what were your thoughts on taking the lane, especially given speed limits? For example, is there a legal issue with a 15 mile per hour cyclist taking his or her lane on a 25 per mile road? I routinely take my lane at a 15 mile per hour zone near my home with no bike lane and on-street parking, but feel less comfortable doing so when the speed limit increases to 25.
Okay, well, actually, speed is not the determining factor here. The law basically says when you're riding your bike on the roadway, you have to ride as close as practicable to the right-hand side of the road, with exceptions. One exception is if you're riding in something called a substandard width lane. And that means that's a lane where a bicyclist and a motorist really can't safely pass side by side or drive side by side. And that, I believe, is what you'll see on the roadways as sharrows. We're basically telling motorists, hey, it's a narrow lane, bicyclists can take the lane. So you can take the lane if it is a, quote, substandard width lane. Now, you also have to exercise common sense. I always tell people, you know, you want to be right under the law, but you don't want to be injured. So I've given you the law, use it to your best advantage, but also exercise safe cycling rules for yourself.
Thank you very much, Gary. I'll pass it back to Maka for to field other questions.
There's Mike and Tim with their hands raised. So go ahead, Mike and Tim. And if any, we have a few minutes left. So if anybody has any other questions, feel free to raise your hand.
Yeah, thanks. I had a question. What do you have any reservation using the term accident, and what's the thought within the legal community? Because I'm sure you're aware that there's a movement against using the term in journalism and policy situations, because if you actually look at the definition, it implies without an apparent cause or without the ability to attribute it to somebody, basically nobody's at fault. And I just want to see, you know, I see the signs all the time from PI attorneys on the side of the road, accident, and everybody's obviously coming at from a different angle, but I'm interested in what you think of that movement and or why you use the term.
I use the term because it's a well-recognized term. I would not use that term in litigation, though. The term I would use would be incident or collision. Because accident does seem, well, you know, gosh, it's an accident. It's nobody's fault. That's what people think. Well, like I said, in my cases, if I'm in litigation, I don't use it at all. But when I'm talking to groups, it seems like it's easily recognized.
Gotcha, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. We at SVBC, we also use the word crash instead of accident. So that's a good question. Tim has his hand raised, and then we do have a couple of last questions in the chat too.
I'm okay, Monica. I can keep going for a while.
Okay, thank you.
Okay? They're very good questions. I'm enjoying it. Thank you.
Hi,
Feel free to drop off if
Tim.
you to.
Sorry. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear
All
you.
right, awesome. So double question. I'm surprised because I hear that you say like a camera is good, because I've heard many situations where people had license plates on camera, or accidents happened and they wrote down the license plate, and then the person says, oh, that wasn't me driving, my car was stolen, some excuse like that. In your experience, is that rare or common, and what are some counter measures you can do to prove that the person was actually driving? Secondly, there's a situation where there is a bike lane, and where I tell my children to bike on the sidewalk anyway, because I think it's the road is too busy and it's just not safe. but I'm not actually sure if that's according to the law.
Okay, let's start with the evidence of a license plate. When the driver goes, it wasn't me, my car was stolen, it just wasn't me. Well, what would happen if you got to court is you would certainly authenticate the photograph or the film, put it into evidence. Secondly, you would have your client, I'd have my client testify that that was the license plate. Then the defendant would get up and try to deny it. And then the jury would have to weigh who had the more credible evidence. We normally prevail in this. If somebody comes up with a silly excuse and said their car was stolen, well, let's go further. Did you call the police? Did you report it? Did you tell your insurance company your car was stolen? When did you get it back? You can go on and on with this. So try not to be too fearful of people who are lying. They do, it happens, but thanks to good cross-examination and investigation, but very seldom do their arguments hold up. Let's talk about your kids. I've raised my children, and I raised them in a neighborhood where it was relatively safe to ride on the street. But I told them to ride on the sidewalk because I was concerned. They were young, and in my neighborhood, it was legal to ride your bike on the sidewalk, and it worked out just fine. So the real question is, do they have to ride in the roadway, or can they ride on the sidewalk? They can ride on the sidewalk unless there is a local law preventing it. So there's no state law that says you can or cannot ride on the sidewalk if you're on a bicycle. The state says we're leaving it up to the cities and the local jurisdictions. So what you'd have to do is contact your local police department and say, is it legal to ride a bike on the sidewalk, and give them the location, because it can be legal in some areas and illegal in others. Usually it's restricted in business districts. In residential areas, it's usually permitted. But call the police department. If they can't give you an answer, you can simply go online. I'm not sure what city you're in, but go to the municipal code and go to the bicycling section or the sidewalk section, and it'll be there. So I tend to agree with you in terms of being a parent and keeping your children safe, but just double check the local rule.
But it's specifically where there is a bike lane. So there's a 4-lane street. It has a separated bike lane, and then there's a sidewalk. I heard that if there is a bike lane, the cyclist has to be in the bike lane. But I think that applies to, you cannot be in the road. You have to be in the bike lane, as opposed to you can still actually also ride on the sidewalk. Is that correct?
Tim, the answer is yes.
Okay.
If you are riding on the roadway and there is a bike lane on the roadway, as a general rule, you have to ride in the bike lane. There are exceptions to that, but one of the exceptions isn't, you got to ride on the sidewalk. So can you ride on the sidewalk when there's a bike lane on the roadway? The answer is yes, because the only time you've got to be in that bike lane is when you're on the actual roadway. Okay, good.
Go ahead. We have Akko, Edward, Jordan, and Kevin, and you guys go ahead and you all feel free to ask your questions.
Yes, thank you. I'm also involved in teaching adult or youth classes, and for the adults, we try to teach, I think Tim also put it in the chat, to control the lane at intersections, to avoid those kinds of right hook areas, which would mean that we may not be in the scope anymore of riding as far to the right as practicable. So, and also you mentioned that you did see some rare and high-speed collisions too. So my question is, in your experience, what is the greater risk for bicyclists not being noticed and being hit somewhere somehow, or is there also more of an exposure if you do not ride to the right side of the road?
That is a very good question, and it's almost a dilemma. Neither choice is great, in my opinion. Again, legally, got to ride as close as practicable to the right-hand side of the road, with exceptions like substandard width lane. In terms of what to do after that, which one is safer? I honestly couldn't give you an opinion because I think you need a bicycle ride expert, maybe a licensed cycling instructor through the League of American Bicyclists can give you some pointers. All I can comment on is the law. I'm sorry I couldn't give you anything more specific.
Hey, Gary, it's Ed Morimoto. Thank you very much for doing this and being so generous with your time. I wanted to ask a question about this. A number of times you said as far right that is practicable. And also if there's a bike lane, you need to be in it. As someone who's been in a couple dooring accidents in their cycling career, I'm assuming that it would be an exception for the cases, and I see this all the time, where you have a bike lane adjacent to parallel parking that is still within the swing distance of all of those doors. So I, as a cyclist, will generally, if I can, skirt as close to that bike lane line as I can. But if I don't think that's safe enough, I will then move into the lane, to avoid potentially getting swung by an errant parked car. I'm assuming that falls under the kind of exceptions that you mentioned when you cite that term, but just wanted to check.
Good question. My answer to that question is yes, you can move over because the law says you can move out of a bike lane to avoid a hazard. Now, I haven't litigated this, but I can just hear the defense side. There was no hazard. All the doors were closed. It wasn't until the door was open that there was a hazard, and then you can move out. My argument is this is a known hazard to cyclists. We have the right to move out of there so we don't get into an accident. I haven't litigated it yet. I would only say that if you're moving out of the bike lane, obviously do it carefully. But I wish I had a litigated answer for it, but I'm on your side. I think you move out and stay away from the doors because the injuries are substantial in these door accidents.
Thank you.
And then we have Jordan and Kevin. And I think I do actually have another meeting coming up. So we will, is it okay, Gary, if we end at 1:30?
That's fine with me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll
Yeah, sure.
Thank you again. This is awesome that you're spending all this extra time with us. So go ahead, Jordan, and then Kevin.
Yeah, so I had 3 follow-up questions. One was on the GPS thing. So we talked about the accuracy of the GPS device, but do you know like how frequently it would need to be taking GPS points for it to be useful, like every minute, every second, or somewhere in between that? Follow up to the previous question about hazards that allow you to move out of the bike lane. Would you also include in that, like say, storm grates or longitudinal joints as other reasons why the bike lane might be hazardous and you might need to legally be allowed to move out? And I won't ask my last question.
Sure.
Okay, let's talk about GPS. To answer your question, I don't know the answer. I would have to defer to an engineer, which I have in the past. And every case is different. So unfortunately, I just don't have the expertise for that one. But the second one, in regard to moving out of a bike lane because you're approaching a storm grate or another hazard, absolutely yes. In fact, to go one step further, if there's a storm grate or storm drain in a bike lane, it has to have cross hatchings on it. It just can't be parallel to your line of travel, the openings. So yes, that would be a hazard, and I would move out carefully and then move back in.
Report them. Report them to your city. If you do find places that have them.
And that's right, Cindy. And so once again, we talked about the city being on notice. The more they're on notice, the more liable they could become, and the more they are going to realize there's a problem there. I mean, they actually review points of accidents or hazards periodically, and they send folks out to fix them. So thank you for adding that, Cindy. I appreciate it.
I had asked down in New Almaden too, strange one to ask for, but I asked them if they could put up a sign that said, "Look, watch out for deer," because I go there in the evening, go up that hill, and I'll be darned if some little Bambi doesn't come across the street, you know, and nobody has any signs there to say anything. A lot of places do have signs, you know, but
Well, yeah.
whatever they put up for sign for is good.
And keep copies of your emails or your letters. I mean, don't do a phone call, do an email,
yeah.
do a letter, get something
Yep.
in writing. Yeah.
Writing, yeah. Real quick, like the stop law.
Take one last question from Kevin and then Jordan.
Thank you, Monica. And Gary, thanks for your time. About putting or giving notice to cities and how that can potentially incentivize the city's behavior about how they design roadways or repair them or fix them or maintain them. Do you have any, there could be a spectrum of options of notices, right? Like one example could be just an email of an anecdote from an afternoon saying I had a bad experience on this road. Another could be, or maybe on the opposite side of that spectrum is, evidence of a month-long survey of near misses or collisions on a given roadway or intersection. Is there an exemplar example that you have in mind that you would love to find when you are pursuing a civil case against, say, a city? And if there is, what would it look like? And secondarily, how easy is it for you to find this kind of evidence in the course of discovery? Is there a way that people who want to provide notice to cities like this can make it easier for you to find them? Sure.
Well, okay. So in terms of putting them on notice, really the best way to do it is to use a claim form. But if you don't technically have a claim for damages, you might want to just start with their claim form and answer the questions about where it happened, what time it happened, how it happened, or even better yet, just call the city. Tell them you want to tell them about something that's a dangerous condition. Do they have a form for it? Every city's different. So I think first is maybe a phone call to the city engineer or the traffic department or an email. I would not wait for a survey to put them on notice. I'd put them on notice as soon as possible. I will tell you that if you can send them a photograph, that would be extremely helpful. But other than that, I'd say just contact them, see if they've got a form. If not, you can always just get their standard claim form for damages and perhaps just fill out the top half or the first half of it and send it in. Next thing is, in terms of getting it through discovery, it's subject to discovery. It's usually not a problem. As long as it's the same location, generally.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, it is 1:29. So Gary, did you want to say any last words? Again, super appreciate this extra half hour that you provided for us.
Well, you're all very welcome. I want to thank you again for joining me today. I hope you learned a lot, not just about California law, but how to avoid these accidents in the first place. And I want to thank you for your great questions. These are really interesting. And thank you for staying late and working with me. So best to all of you. As I tell my clients over the years, I hope I never hear from you again about a bike accident, but certainly if you ever have questions about advocacy or general questions, just send me an email. It's on the website. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, folks, for joining. Really appreciate it. Have a great day. And again, huge thanks to you, Gary.
Wait.
Thank you.